Some moments change you forever. They burn into your memory, creeping into your thoughts when you least expect them. They make you question everything: who you are, what you know, what you thought was true. That stormy night? It wasn't just the wind that shattered the silence. It wasn't just the rain that drenched the streets or the thunder that shook the walls. What I saw, what my neighbor did, still chills me to my core. The rain had been falling all day, slow and steady at first, but by nightfall it turned violent. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows. The kind of storm that makes the world feel smaller, darker, like something is waiting in the shadows. The power went out. Everything went dark. Silence, except for the storm raging outside. Then, a light. Faint, flickering. Candlelight. Across the street. Ethan's house. I don't know why I walked to the window. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe instinct. But when I looked, I saw something I wasn't meant to see. Two shadows. Moving. Close. Too close. Then, one of them stepped into the light. It wasn't his wife. My stomach dropped. My breath caught. Ethan. My neighbor. The one who waved every morning. The one who always asked about my day. The one whose wife was out of town. He wasn't alone. And the way he looked at her, the way she looked at him, I knew. In the way his hands moved. In the way she leaned into him. In the way they stood in that glow, completely unaware that someone was watching. I should have looked away. I should have walked away. But I didn't. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just watching a betrayal. I was feeling it. Not in anger. Not in disgust. In recognition. And that's when I realized, this storm wasn't just outside. It was inside me too. If I had known what was happening just a few feet away, maybe I could have stopped it. But some truths only reveal themselves when it's too late. And this? This was only the beginning. If you love real-life stories that uncover the shocking, the hidden, and the unthinkable, subscribe now. You won't believe what happened next. The first time I saw Ethan, he was standing in his driveway, sleeves rolled up, working on his car. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over everything. I had just come back from the store, struggling with grocery bags while my husband barely looked up from his phone. Ethan had noticed. He jogged over, smiled, took a bag from my hands. Let me help you with that. I remember how easy his presence felt, like he actually saw me, like I wasn't just another part of the scenery. My husband barely glanced up from the couch when I walked in. That was a year ago. Since then, I've noticed things. The way Ethan always lingers just a second longer when we run into each other outside. The way his eyes search mine when he laughs at something I say. The way he seems to know when I need a little kindness, when I need someone to ask, "How are you?" and actually mean it. And I've noticed something about myself too. How my heart beats just a little faster when I see him. How I stand at the window just a little longer, watching his house. How I wonder what he's doing when his wife is away. She travels a lot. Work, she says. Gone for weeks at a time. My husband is always home. But somehow, he's never really here. We used to be different. There were late-night conversations, hands brushing in the kitchen, soft laughter between us. Now it's silence. Now, it's empty dinner tables and half-finished conversations cut off by the glow of a phone screen. I tell myself it's normal. Marriage goes through phases. People get comfortable. But comfortable starts to feel a lot like invisible. And invisible starts to feel unbearable. That night, as I stood by the window watching Ethan, something inside me twisted. The way he touched her. Slow. Intentional. The way his hands lingered. The way her body curved into his. The way their world existed only between them. I exhaled, pressing my fingers against the glass. It wasn't jealousy. Not exactly. It was something deeper. Something that curled in my stomach and whispered, "When was the last time someone looked at you like that?" I blinked, stepping back, my breath unsteady. My own house felt cold, too big, too quiet. I turned. My husband was still asleep, his back to me. A lump rose in my throat. I could still hear the rain pounding outside, but inside, the storm had already started. The rain pounded against the windows, harder now, the wind howling through the trees. Thunder rolled in the distance, closer each time, shaking the walls. I could feel the air shift, heavy with something more than just the storm. Then, darkness. The hum of the fridge, the faint glow of the hallway light, all of it gone in an instant. The house fell silent, except for the steady rhythm of the storm outside. I stood there for a moment, heart pounding, my reflection barely visible in the window. I turned, fumbling for my phone, for a flashlight, anything to cut through the darkness. And then, a knock. Sharp. Urgent. My breath hitched. I hesitated. Another knock. I walked slowly to the door, fingers tightening around the knob before I pulled it open. Ethan. Soaked to the bone, his shirt clinging to his skin, rain dripping from his hair. His breathing was unsteady, chest rising and falling as if he'd run through the storm to get here. "A tree came down in my yard," he said, voice low, almost breathless. "Took out part of the fence. Power's out." I didn't want to sit in the dark alone. His wife wasn't home. Of course she wasn't. I swallowed hard, stepping aside. "Come in." He hesitated, just for a second, then stepped over the threshold, shaking off the rain. I closed the door behind him, sealing us into the quiet, into something neither of us could name. The only light came from the few candles I'd lit in the living room, their glow flickering against the walls. The air between us felt different now, thicker, charged with something unsaid. I handed him a towel. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, cold and damp. He ran the towel over his face, through his hair, and exhaled. "Didn't mean to barge in like this," he said, voice softer now. He stopped, shaking his head. I sat on the edge of the couch, watching him. "It's okay." A beat of silence. He glanced toward the hallway. "Is he asleep?" I nodded. "Yeah." Another silence, longer this time. The rain pounded harder. A gust of wind rattled the windows. Ethan sighed, looking down at his hands. "It's funny. I used to love storms. When I was a kid, my dad and I would sit on the porch, just watching. He'd say, 'Storms show you what's strong enough to last.'" He huffed out of breath. I don't think I ever really understood what he meant. Not until now. I watched him, candlelight flickering against his face. "Storms show you what's strong enough to last," I murmured. His eyes lifted to mine. A slow nod. "Yeah." Something in my chest tightened. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm himself. "She's gone a lot," he said finally. "My wife." I knew that. Everyone in the neighborhood did. "She travels for work," I said, though it wasn't a question. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah." He exhaled through his nose. "That's what I tell people." Something in the way he said it made my stomach flip. I swallowed. "Ethan," his eyes met mine. "Do you ever feel it?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "That kind of alone?" The words settled between us, heavy and unmovable. I could have lied. I could have told him I didn't know what he meant. But I did. I knew it in the quiet nights, in the spaces between words left unsaid, in the way I had started to feel like a ghost in my own home. I nodded. He watched me, his expression unreadable, something flickering behind his eyes. The room felt too small, the air too thick. A crack of thunder shook the house. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But in that moment, in the glow of candlelight, in the silence between us, I knew. And so did he. I told myself I was just being kind. That's all it was. A neighbor caught in the storm. A little warmth, a little light. Nothing more. But my heart was racing. I could hear it, feel it, pounding in my chest, in my throat, in the pulse of my wrist as I reached for another candle. The flickering glow barely held back the darkness, casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. Ethan sat across from me, elbows still resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. His fingers rubbed absent-mindedly against each other, like he was trying to make sense of something he couldn't say out loud. And I was hyper-aware of him. Every movement. Every breath. The slow rise and fall of his shoulders. The damp strands of hair curling at the edges. The way his jaw tightened every time thunder rumbled through the house. I wasn't just watching him. I was feeling him. It was wrong. I was married. He was married. But my body didn't seem to care. My skin was humming, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Like something dormant had just started stirring, stretching, waking up from a long sleep. I reached for another candle, and so did he. Our hands brushed. A pause. A look. I should have pulled away faster. I should have laughed it off, made some offhand comment about clumsy hands or storm jitters. But I didn't. His fingers lingered against mine, just for a second. Barely there, barely anything. And yet, it felt like everything. Heat crawled up my spine, spreading through my chest, pooling low in my stomach. It was nothing. And it was too much. I pulled back, curling my fingers into my palm. The air between us shifted. He exhaled, slow, steady. His eyes flickered to mine, searching, unreadable. I swallowed hard, looking away. Was it just the storm making everything feel more intense? Or was I waking up after years of feeling numb? I thought about my husband, alone in our bed, turned away from me like always. I thought about the way he used to touch me, how, at some point, it had started to feel more like an obligation than a desire. I thought about the nights I spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was just what marriage became. Ethan shifted in his seat, drawing my attention back to him. His expression had changed, softer, something close to understanding settling in his features. Like he knew. Like he had been there too. The candlelight flickered, casting his face in shadows. For a moment, the whole world felt small. Just the two of us. Just this moment. And I didn't know if I wanted it to end. A flash of lightning cut through the darkness, illuminating Ethan's face for just a second. His eyes were on me. Not in the casual way people look at each other during a conversation. Not in the way neighbors glance in passing. This was something else. It was focused. Intentional. Lingering. I should have looked away. But I didn't. His gaze flickered down to my lips. Heat crawled up my neck. My pulse hammered. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. I should get us something to drink. I stood too quickly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The air felt thick, heavy. I moved toward the kitchen, away from the pull, away from whatever had settled between us. But he followed. I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and measured. My breath caught as I reached for a glass from the cabinet. He was close. Closer than before. I could feel his presence before I saw him, warmth radiating from behind me. I turned, and he was right there. Not touching me. Not saying a word. Just there. Watching. Waiting. The air between us tightened. The candle on the counter flickered. The space felt too small, pressing us together even though we weren't touching. I swallowed. Reached for another glass. He did too. Our fingers brushed. I could have pulled away. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. I froze. His hand didn't move either. Another flash of lightning lit up the room, followed by a low rumble of thunder. Neither of us spoke. His breathing was slow, deep. Mine was too fast, too unsteady. His fingers, still damp from the rain, barely grazed my skin. Just a whisper of a touch. But I felt it everywhere. And then, he stepped closer. Not much. Just enough. Enough that the air between us disappeared. Enough that I could feel his breath, warm against my skin. His voice was low, rough. Tell me to go. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I needed to say it. I needed to end this. My husband was in the next room. Sleeping, unaware. Ethan was still waiting. Still close. My heart was racing. Tell him to go. I didn't. Because, in that moment, I didn't want him to. A sudden crash outside shattered the moment. A heavy branch, torn loose by the wind, slammed against the house with a force that rattled the windows. I sucked in a sharp breath. Ethan stepped back. Not much, just a few inches. But it was enough. Enough for the spell to break, for the air between us to thin. His hands curled into fists at his sides. His jaw tightened. For a long second, neither of us spoke. The storm roared around us, rattling through the walls, echoing the chaos inside me. My pulse was wild, my breath shallow. I could still feel the heat of him, the way he had hovered so close, the way his voice had lingered in my head, tell me to go. I should have said it then. I should have said it before. But now, there was no question. I had been seconds away from making a choice I couldn't undo. Seconds away from something I couldn't take back. My fingers gripped the counter behind me as I forced myself to look at him. His expression had changed. The intensity in his eyes had dimmed, replaced with something else. A flicker of something close to regret. Or maybe something closer to restraint. He exhaled slowly. Neither of us moved. Neither of us knew what to say. The house felt colder now. The moment that had burned between us just seconds ago was already fading, already shifting into something unspoken, something neither of us could name. I wet my lips, my voice barely a whisper. You should go. Ethan didn't move at first. His gaze held mine, searching, hesitating. Then, finally, he nodded. A slow, understanding nod. Not angry. Not surprised. Like he had already known how this would end. He stepped back again. Then another step. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. I stayed frozen, listening to the soft creak of the front door as it opened. Listening as it clicked shut behind him. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The house was silent again. Except for the storm. And the storm inside me was far from over. I leaned against the counter, my hands gripping the edge like it was the only thing holding me up. My fingers were shaking. My breath came too fast, too shallow. The air felt different now, colder, heavier. The warmth that had filled the space just moments ago was gone, replaced by something else. Something quieter. Something darker. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady myself, but the what-ifs came rushing in. What if my husband had woken up? What if I hadn't stopped? What if that branch hadn't fallen? I could still feel the ghost of Ethan's presence, the heat of him so close, the way his breath had brushed against my skin. My body still remembered the way it had leaned into him, how it had wanted more, how I had hesitated just long enough to make it clear. I told myself I had done the right thing. I had told him to go. But I had let it get that far. And that was almost worse. I forced myself to move, to push away from the counter, to cross the room even though my legs felt weak beneath me. I found myself at the window before I could stop myself. Ethan was walking across the street, his head slightly bowed, his hands shoved into his pockets. The rain was still coming down hard, soaking him all over again. He didn't run. He didn't rush. And he didn't look back. I should have been relieved. Instead, my stomach twisted. I turned away from the window, my eyes falling on the hallway, on the door to my bedroom. The door was still closed. He was still asleep. Completely unaware. The contrast between the two men, one walking away into the night, the other sleeping soundly in the next room, hit me like a weight in my chest. My husband, the man I had built a life with, the man I had vowed to be faithful to, had no idea what had just happened under his own roof. He didn't know that I had stood in the kitchen with another man, breathless and trembling. That I had let the air grow thick with something dangerous. That I had hesitated just long enough to prove to myself that some part of me wanted it. And Ethan, he knew. We both knew. I wrapped my arms around myself like I could somehow hold everything in, stop the guilt from settling deeper. Because this wasn't nothing. I had stepped into something dangerous, something I couldn't pretend wasn't real. Emotional infidelity. And sometimes, that could be just as destructive as the real thing. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flickering candle, my fingers tracing the rim of the untouched glass of water in front of me. My mind wouldn't slow down. Was it real? Or was it just the loneliness? The storm had created a world of its own, a night outside of reality, where time blurred, where silence made emotions louder, where distance between two people could shrink until it was almost nothing. But now, the storm was passing. And I didn't know what was left behind. Did Ethan feel the same, or had it just been the moment? A fleeting thing, fueled by the darkness, the rain, the quiet of an empty house? Or had he been waiting for this just as much as I had? I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling shakily. The guilt was settling in now like a shadow I couldn't shake. I hadn't done anything. Not really. But I had wanted to, and that was enough. I glanced toward the hallway, toward the closed bedroom door. My husband was still there, still sleeping, still completely unaware. Would he have noticed if I hadn't come to bed? Would he have cared? The thought cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I tried to remember the last time he had looked at me the way Ethan had. The last time his voice had dipped low with something unspoken. The last time his touch had lingered like he was afraid to let go. I couldn't. I thought back to how he used to be. The quiet nights filled with whispered conversations, the way he used to pull me into his arms without a word, just because he wanted to. Somewhere along the way, all of that had faded. Now, we lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, but there was a distance between us wider than any storm. Ethan, a man who was practically a stranger, had made me feel seen in a way my husband hadn't in years. And that was the real betrayal, wasn't it? Not the moment in the kitchen. Not the way our fingers had brushed. But the fact that some part of me had wanted that moment more than I wanted to fix what was broken in my marriage. Could I ever go back to the way things were? Did I even want to? The silence in the house felt heavier now, pressing down on me. The weight of everything I hadn't said, everything I had ignored, everything I had felt but never voiced. I thought about Ethan. I would see him again. In the daylight, in the normal rhythm of life. At the mailbox. On the sidewalk. In the casual way neighbors do, with polite smiles and small talk. But we both knew. The tension wouldn't disappear just because the storm had passed. It would still be there, lingering beneath the surface. Unspoken. Waiting. Some choices change everything. And some never get made. But they still leave a mark. I sat there in the dim candlelight, my thoughts tangled, my pulse still uneven. The house was silent now, the storm fading into the distance, but inside me, something else had begun. Something I couldn't take back. I had told Ethan to go, but I had waited too long. I had let the moment stretch, let the silence speak for me, let my hesitation linger in the air between us. And that hesitation meant something. I wasn't blind to it. I wasn't innocent. Because the truth is, it wasn't just Ethan that night. It was me, too. And now I was left with the weight of it, the knowledge that I had wanted something I shouldn't have. That I had let myself lean into the feeling instead of pulling away from it. That a single second longer, a single breath closer, and everything would have been different. What would you have done? Have you ever been in a moment like this, where a single choice could change everything? Where the line between right and wrong blurred so quietly, so slowly, that you didn't even realize you were stepping over it until it was too late? Let's talk in the comments. No judgment, just real conversations. And if you love true, raw, real-life stories that make you question, feel, and reflect, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones that are easy to tell. Some storms pass. Others leave scars. And some linger in the spaces between what almost happened and what never will. I'll see Ethan again. And next time. I don't know if I'll be strong enough to walk away.